So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is Piyush Mahapatra. Piyush is an orthopaedic surgeon and Director of Innovation at Open Medical. He is on the NHS Clinical Entrepreneur Programme and is responsible for leading cloud-based digital patient pathway solutions in a number of specialities. He's widely published, and he's going to talk to us today on the role of technology in managing the post-COVID elective surgical backlog. Look forward to hearing your talk, Piyush. Welcome to the stage.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to talk to you today about technology. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are being thrown a lot of technological solutions at the moment, and it's really about trying to understand what do I need, what solutions am I looking for. So I'm going to give you a very high-level overview of the kinds of questions to ask when you're looking at technology. So these are some of the terms that you'll come across and some of the key areas that, again, I'll focus on, particularly around things like cloud computing, interoperability, modularity, and of course, user experience, which is often overlooked. So I'm a practicing clinician myself, and having that end user experience and really being able to understand how these technologies are going to work on the shop floor and deliver that value that's often cited, I think is critical. Our journey at Open Medical started with very much a theatre whiteboard that was rubbed off one day, and that's what really pushed us to develop these cloud solutions and technologies for theatres. We've sort of grown since then. We're now active in over 70 NHS sites, close to 1 million patient pathways. And again, that kind of pathway approach, which has been cited quite a few times today already this morning, is something that I think is critical when you're making those decisions about which technology to go for. The challenge, I won't labour the point too much on this, it's been something that's been touched upon a lot. 5.5 million currently waiting for treatment, and as Professor Briggs mentioned, there's this hidden waiting list of people who haven't yet presented, so it's estimated the waiting list is going to go up to about 12.5 million. The key sort of challenges, I'm sure all of you know this, that you're faced with them every day, around decreased capacity, being able to put fewer patients through the system. There's a lack of staff, lack of workforce. You often end up with disjointed processes, and the technology often doesn't communicate and doesn't help you join up that process. And finally, care pathways are becoming increasingly complex with multiple stakeholders. We've already heard today about regional hubs and high volume, low complexity centres. How do you get patients into those environments? How do you actually get that data to flow correctly? So those are some of the challenges. So looking at the solution. So again, you have to ask yourself, how can technology help and where do I start? Technology can be pivotal in helping you to sort of plan, track, and review your waiting lists and give you oversight of what's happening with your patient cohort. And again, I'll go on to talk about some of the importance of that soon. And what is the opportunity for technology to actually deliver benefits? So this is some work that we've done, but you can improve, you can have reductions in staffing costs of up to £500,000, and additional efficiency savings in terms of reducing cancellations of up to 5 million. And this is sort of single trust, single region. And if you extrapolate that across the wider market, there's obviously huge benefits involved. Through digital pathways, you can improve referral to treatment times, again, through a variety of mechanisms, whether that be appropriate triage or redirection to the right pathway. And you can move pathways into different or completely novel ways of treating patients. So some pathways are very amenable to full virtual treatments, and actually you can try and decrease your waiting list by negating the requirement for surgery. And obviously all the knock-on effects that has in terms of bed days saved and other efficiency benefits. So overall, we want to try and achieve a single unified service And again, I've put cloud at the center of this because I think really it's the only way that we're going to achieve working in a regional way with multiple sites to deliver the benefits and the value that we want. And the few key components of delivering that service are particularly around infrastructure, interoperability, and that kind of collaboration and seamless movement. So looking at some of the problems in a bit more detail that I've talked about, so we have a decrease in preoperative assessment capacity. I think this is pretty much well known. There's reduced flow through the department, and the solution, one of the solutions I should say, is around digital preoperative assessment. This is something that's been advocated by a number of groups and is really being sort of put into guidance that every department should be considering this. So again, there are a number of suppliers that are doing digital preoperative screening, and the main aim is that you can pre-collect some information from patients, and that is very suited for a small cohort of patients who are very fit and well, have no comorbidities, and you can have a patient-led pre-assessment process. But that does have its limitations. Often nowadays we're dealing with a much more complex cohort of patients that require additional specialist input and may need further investigations and even escalation. So one of the things that I think is very important is to look at the whole integrated pathway, and again I'll stress the point that a pathway approach is really critical in trying and drive efficiency, because you need to look at every step. And with a digital pre-op assessment, it's really important to think about what's the next step. What happens when we find the patient who needs further investigations? How do you escalate that to the anaesthetic team? What's their workflow? And being able to do that in a very streamlined and efficient manner, and then you can monitor the effects that that has on your waiting list, is something that I think will really help glean those final bits of improvement out of a digital pre-op assessment. And again, creating workflows and work lists with prioritization and timings and having that transparency is something that I think needs to be looked at. So I won't go through this pathway, but this is an example of what a digital surgical pathway may look like. You can have pre-assessment and escalation workflows that are delivered entirely digitally without having patients coming in, so that all of those separate touch points can be done through a combination of remotely or having the patient attend only as and when required. It's by having active waiting list management, it's much easier to have a standby pool of patients that can step in at the last minute. So being able to filter your waiting list to get those 3 patients that are available at short notice that are past pre-assessment with a surgical time of less than an hour to fill that slot and maximize your list capacity. So those are some of the benefits that technology can bring. And obviously the regional and the different site working is something that's going to come up and crop up over and over again. How do you utilize the private sector effectively? Do you have the technology to be able to go in there? Can you look at your list when you're in the private sector? What happens to your operation note? Am I ferrying bits of paper back and forth in taxis? So having a cloud system that's decoupled from existing infrastructure is something that, again, will really just help unlock and give you that flexibility to alter your clinical pathways to match evolving requirements. And then post-operatively, there's a whole raft of post-operative monitoring tools and patient-reported outcomes capture tools, which again can be utilised. So transparency. I think for me, this is the one key thing that will help everyone, is having a technology that gives you transparency over your waiting list, over your backlog, being able to actively filter that in a meaningful way to get you that cohort of patients that you need to assign to be able to best utilize resources. So the next problem is around what happens. We know we've got large waiting lists. What's going to happen to these patients as they deteriorate? How do you reprioritize them? How do you have access to that harm review process that is being advised that we should all be conducting? And again, it's all around transparency. So having a digital solution that you can record an assessment on, that again provides a unified, holistic view of what's happening to that patient. And then being able to rapidly reprioritize them. So you can see here that this patient, apologies, it's pixelated a little bit, but it will come through on the app. You can see that after a conversation with the patient, their harm review was upgraded and they've been upgraded to a higher priority level. And that consequently then moves them up the waiting list, because that is something that unfortunately we are going to have to do to some extent. So regional working, again, there's often a technological separation. Systems don't talk to each other. There is an element still of paper-based documentation, anaesthetic charts, consent forms, and those niche areas need to be looked at so that you can go truly paperless to then allow you to work in organisations or in settings that aren't digitally linked to your host organisation. I think the lack of interoperability is a bit of a myth. I think this is something that we feel fairly strongly about. You can see that we've integrated with pretty much every supplier out there, another system out there, and this is true of every modern system. There isn't really a technological barrier to integration. So I would very much push that interoperability is the mantra, and it really has to be in place, particularly when you're looking at cloud solutions. So that's one of the kind of key take-home points. And then, as I mentioned, some of the other aspects around technology, and this is just to illustrate ideas, digital consent. So how do you get rid of that paper consent form? So digital consent solutions will help you get rid of that last bit of paper. And again, an audit in an organisation I worked with that has an EPR is almost paperless. 50% of their paper consent forms were nowhere to be seen at 6 months. So, that's a legal record. So there's a massive risk there. So digital consent, again, is something, particularly if you've got high mobility and flexibility in your pathway, is something that you probably need to look at. Task management, that's an interesting one. So again, there are some task management solutions out there. I think they're useful for specific scenarios. If you have a significant distance between your operating theatres and your waiting rooms or your wards, and you need early sighting of when to get the next patient. But I think there are some limitations, and the full benefits are yet to be understood around task management options. So I realised I've sort of focused mostly on the early phase about how to get patients into theatre the most efficiently, and I think the reason I've done that is, in my opinion, our current biggest bottleneck, about how do we use theatre most efficiently, how do we get patients into the correct environment, into the right setting, and how do we fill the lists. But I just did want to sort of touch upon a few kind of intra-operative technologies that are coming through, so particularly things like compatibility testing, so it's the next stage of the Scan for Safety programme, so organisations like the National Joint Registry are pushing this, and again, this is something that I think will be coming more to the fore over the next few months or couple of years. Operative workflow trackers, again, this is very new, so technologies to track the intra-operative workflow of a surgeon, so this is looking at a particular surgeon's workflow and being able to update the theatre team in real time about what the next step is in order to try and drive down surgical time. And other associated technologies like remote and teleassistance, which again are all in their infancy, and I think the benefits are still to be sort of worked out and realised. Workforce technologies, again, this is something that I think everyone is looking at. Workforce issues are obviously huge, and if you are moving to regional models of care, it's important to think about how are your staff going to move, whether you're going to need digital staff banks, digital rostering technologies, and the NHS and NHSX in particular is moving towards digital passporting. So you have a digital identity that you can then take to your next trust or a different organisation to allow you to work in that setting. So those are all things that are sort of in development. Some are more mature than others, particularly around staff banks and rostering, which many of you may use already. And passports are sort of coming in as we speak. So that's something that will hopefully help alleviate some of those workforce challenges that you may be facing. So I just wanted to sort of conclude with a little bit around a case study that we've done on using technology to tackle the elective surgical backlog, and this was sort of creating a full digital pre-op pathway with some COVID measures, and the idea behind it is you minimise the touch points required face-to-face for that patient, be able to communicate everything to them digitally, and essentially have them attend only when they're needed. So this was at a major sort of level 2 trauma centre with 1 million patients going through the trust every year, operating capacity of 10 to 12,000 normally, with split site working. We also ended up having to during the year that we've been in use, we ended up outsourcing some work to the private sector, and again, a lot of those patients were managed on the same platform. So the project itself was a multi-stakeholder project, and again, this is really to highlight the importance, if you are going to go down the digital transformation journey, of having that multi-stakeholder buy-in, thinking about all the different spokes. And often what you need is a solution that can be customized to every specialty, but then be able to be united and coherent so it provides an even and homogeneous platform for everyone to be able to use. So these are some of the challenges, and again, I've included this mainly for use in the app for when you go, when you take this away, but we try to tackle a lot of those issues that I've already spoken about today, but particularly we aim to have speciality specific support, which is, I think, something that is often overlooked. People try and get everyone to comply, but actually ophthalmology do something quite different to maternity, for example. So you do need to have an element of speciality specific customization. And then digital theatre boards, that's something that I think is still not well done by a lot of technologies. The EPRs are often advocated as a major solution to this, and often they're not. So anyone who's used an EPR a lot in practice, I've used it for most of my surgical career, they're architected differently, so that they're based around single patients, they're not based around cohorts and groups, which is why they struggle to do things like theatre boards very well, and unfortunately that is something that they will continue to struggle with. And then automation. So we managed to build in some automation, so every time anyone is now listed for surgery, you can automatically send them a COVID screening consent form to say, I fully understand the risks of within a COVID environment. So you can create some automations to help tackle some governance issues and improve flow. When you're thinking about implementing these, again, think about the process that you're going to go through. So discuss with all your stakeholders, really gather their requirements, and then think about implementing. And often work closely with your suppliers, take an iterative approach. You want suppliers that are agile and flexible, because often you can't get everything right straight away, and it is a sort of process of continuous improvement. So think about that when you're sort of working out how to implement these solutions. So I guess the last couple of minutes, a few take-home points. So with the aim of digital transformation is really to try and help you streamline your process. So think about that as you're sort of putting the technology in. How do you streamline alongside that? It's often an excellent opportunity to be able to make some other changes. Communication is key. So again, pick technologies that help you communicate with different stakeholder groups. Make sure there's escalation components within that to be able to communicate between tiers and again facilitate those workflows, because that's where often the problems arise about what's the next step and those transition points for the patient in their clinical pathway. You want to be able to have ready visualization. As I mentioned, transparency is a real factor in this. You want to be able to assess how these technologies are working. You want your technology to be able to record data, record outcomes, so you can continually drive and improve the service beyond the technological change, so you can implement service changes and use the technology to measure that impact. And as I mentioned, connection and interoperability is key, and overall, ultimately, you want to reduce risk and drive productivity. So we've managed to, in certain organisations, improve theatre utilisation by up to 10%, and that's simply by having transparency. So you have a late-stage cancellation, you're able to fill it. You know that the anaesthetist knows a week or two in advance who their cases are on the list. They have their pre-op assessment. They can access it from home. They can see everything else. You get, by having that early visibility, you can maximise utilisation. And as I said, data is key to all of that. If you are thinking about implementing solutions, there are a whole raft of funding opportunities at the moment. So the SBRI program is particularly interesting. Number 9, Competition 19 has something around implementing technologies and assessing their impact. The Unified Tech Fund, which I'm sure many of you will be aware of, there's 250 million that has to be spent by the end of October. So there are quite vast sums of money centrally to drive these projects. So please, if that is something you are interested in, do get in touch. So as I mentioned, sort of touching on these are key things to look out for when you're making decisions. Modularity, interoperability, user experience, and a cloud system. And overall, you want to try and end up delivering a unified cloud surgical service, because I think that is your best technological answer to dealing with the elective surgical backlog. Great, thank you very much.
Thank you, Piyush, and I'm pretty sure we could all hear a lot more about that great work, and there'll be a chance to ask some questions shortly. But my take-home word there was interoperability. Okay.